Welcome back. Here is the training video for the Workshop 3 presentation, which we have renamed this year. We used to call it research planning, but we didn't actually spend that much time talking about research planning in it. So I've renamed it variables and data collection. And here's some stuff to do. Try to get through the variable stuff fairly quickly because it's a little dry. And spend time on the catapults. The emphasis with the catapults should be on data collection, getting them to actually write down their data, which you will probably have noticed after workshops 1 and 2 can be a little challenging, although some of them take right to it. So, as usual, do your science rocks. Give them a little overview. We're going to talk about variables, collecting data, doing catapults, and then if there's time, working on individual projects. So one important thing to understand about science is that while you might have a fantastic idea, if you don't have a good plan, if you don't write down your data, if you don't follow your plan, you'll just have a big mess on your hand. It's really fun to play around with science, but you're not doing real scientific research if you don't carefully plan and document. So first thing we want to talk about are some really basic parts of doing research, which you've actually already encountered before in the previous workshops, but we want to talk about them a little bit today, and these are called variables. And who can give me a guess as to what a variable might mean? It actually sounds like another word we might use all often, and so hopefully they should say, something that changes, something that varies, although maybe vary isn't a word that you use very often, and occasionally you will get kids who are very confused because they're thinking very V-E-R-Y. But that's okay. So they're just things that can change in our experiment, and we want to think about how we want them to change, or in some cases, not change. So the first variable we like to talk about is our outcome variable, and this is the thing that we're interested in measuring. So for example, with our airplanes last week, this might have been how far a plane flew, or the way in which it flew. Did it fly loopy? Did it nosedive? Did it turn? Did it veer? But ultimately, the outcome variable is the thing we're really interested in, the thing we want to know to answer our research question. Now we do this by trying to introduce some change variables. So example, in last week we may have changed, well we didn't, but we could have changed the style of the plane we folded, but we did change things like the kind of paper, if we added paper clips, or if we put fins on it. So those are the things we decided to change. And how many things did we change last week? And this may confuse them a little bit because we had 3 different questions, but within each group, they really should have only changed one thing. And at their level, they really should only be changing one thing in their science project. We can obviously, it is possible to make a matrix of changes and compare, but we don't really want to get into that with these simple projects. And then there's the third kind of variable, which is kind of tricky because variable means things that change, but it's called a control variable, and it's actually something we do not want to vary, we do not want to change. So things we tried to control last week. So we tried to, if we could, fly inside so there was no wind that could confuse our results. We tried to throw the planes consistently. We tried to throw them from the same place so it was easy to measure. So control variables are the things we want to think about keeping the same all the time. And we can do a little activity just as a whole group with this using a very popular experiment, which is called Mentos and Coke. Everybody knows Mentos and Coke. You make this cool geyser. It's really fun. So, okay, as a group, what do we think the outcome variable is when we're trying to make the highest Mentos and Coke geyser? Now, if our question was something different, our outcome variable would be different. But in this case, hopefully they should be able to come up with how high the geyser was. Exactly. Now, if we were asking the question how fast it was before the geyser took off, then our outcome variable would be time instead of distance. So as our change variable, what did we change in this particular question? They should come up with how many Mentos we put in, right? Was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Mentos? That's what we changed between our different runs of the experiment. What did we keep the same? Well, if we're testing the different number of Mentos, we didn't change the kind of soda, we didn't change the type of soda bottle, we tried to keep our environment the same when we're doing this experiment. So it's not very complicated once you think about it this way, but it is something to think about when you're setting up your experiment. Be sure that you understand what is the outcome you're trying to measure, what things are you going to change, and what things are you going to keep the same. And it's important to write these things down. Judges love to see them on your display board at the fair, and it also helps people understand your experiment. So then we talk a little bit about data collection, how we're going to collect our data and planning that. So first off, what data would you collect for the Mentos and Coke experiment? So what would we collect? Well, obviously we would collect the number of Mentos, You want the kids to come up with these ideas, and they may come up with some extra data. So the two big things would be how many Mentos we put in and how high the geyser was. Those would be our key ones. But we could also measure things like if we had to do it over different times, we might measure the temperature of the room. We might measure how windy it was. You can come up with some interesting variables. I mean, ideally, you would want to control those. If you can't control them, you definitely want to document them. Just a few rules for when we're collecting data. Anybody should be able to look at our data and understand what it means, so it's good to put it in table form. Collect all the data we might need, but at the same time, some data just doesn't really impact our experiment. We don't need to know how hungry you were when you were doing the experiment. We may or may not want to know the temperature depending on the particular experiment we're doing. Scientists do like to err on the side of more data than less, but sometimes we just collect data we don't need and we don't use. It's really important that you collect the right data. It doesn't matter if you collect 50 different data points if you didn't actually measure the right thing. That would be bad if we went through our Mentos and Coke experiment and we measured the room temperature and the wind speed and the number of Mentos and how the humidity was in the air and then forgot to measure how high the geyser went. That'd be pretty bad. And that can definitely happen. So you want to make a plan for what data you're going to collect, how you're going to collect it. So we're actually going to do this today using some tiny catapults. And I believe we have another training video on how to do the catapults. So I'm not going to go super in depth on this. It's also in the curriculum. But basically, we have these popsicle stick catapults, and they want to compare what different kinds of projectiles work with the catapults for going farther. We're going to actually kind of look at two things, but we're going to emphasize how far it's going, but you can also look at how consistent it is, because some of the ammo is capable of going quite far, but doesn't consistently go very far. So we're going to look at that. You don't have to tell them that during this. I'm just telling you. So what data might we want to collect if we want to see if there's a relationship between the type of ammunition and how far it goes? Obviously, how far it goes and what the ammunition is. It kind of is rocket science, but it's not. Well, it's ballistics, but not rocket science. How should we record our data? Hint, it's almost always on a data table, which they will have on their worksheet. So the guidelines for this activity. Make sure that they answer the first few questions on the worksheet, that they keep the catapults in whatever you have designated at the launch area. I encourage you to have them launch on the floor because doing from desktops can confound your data when there's extra drop below the horizon of the desk. That they only should be launching data that they are recording. All launches are for science. We're not just launching pony beads around the room for fun because those things get lost really quickly. Make sure to record all the data. Sometimes they get really excited about launching stuff. I did this in a classroom full of second graders. It was chaotic. They were adorable, but it was chaotic. And then go ahead and get the data. So make sure they clearly understand the instructions before you pass out the supplies, what they're doing, and that they've written down on that first table who's going to actually be collecting each piece of data. It should be structured so that everybody gets a chance to launch at least one projectile and everybody records one piece of data, at least, if not more. Then you can have a discussion with them if there's time about what other kinds of questions we could answer with our data or with our tools if we did our experiment a little bit differently, and get them thinking about different ways you can use data. And then if there's time, this would be time for them to work in groups on their project ideas, refining their questions, writing out their research procedure, maybe mocking up some data tables for what they might collect, good stuff like that, and you get to go around and answer their questions and help them out. So this presentation should be pretty short. You should spend most of the time on the activity, as with all of these workshops, but hopefully if things go well, you will have a little bit of time for them to work on their individual projects, and depending on the nature of the classroom, you can have them work in their groups and go around and help them, or you can workshop things with the whole group if you feel like they're too distractible and going to get off track. So you can have kids talk about their project, ask you questions, you can ask them questions, and try and help them dial into a manageable type of project. Okay. The videos for the fourth workshop are not going to change because we haven't really changed anything about them. You can shorten those up if you want, spend as much time on them as you want. I would encourage you to leave time in that fourth workshop to work wherever the students are at. They're going to be at varying places depending on how much classroom and parent support they have. Alrighty, thanks a lot.